Well, thank you everyone for being back here for our second session with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. The gates of crying were not locked. Crying adults and crying children in classical Jewish texts. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Rabbanit Sarna, and looking forward to another evening of learning.
All right, hi everyone. So I'm not gonna be running out at the end this time. So we can definitely take more questions, put them in the chat, or you can like raise your hand, get Chaya's attention. It's very hard for me to like see people or see the chat while I'm sharing my screen. That's like one of the insurmountable Zoom downsides, apparently. But that's why we have Chaya. So if there's like lots of good questions coming up or people are like really energized, then I'm just like not seeing it. Like Kaya's job is to interrupt. Uh, and yeah, because I think there's like some really fun stuff tonight. Some of the stories that we're gonna look at. So tonight is like Agadata night, just so you know where we're going. Last was Tanakh. Now we're in the Talmud, primarily Agadata, a few it's kind of all I got. And then next week we're gonna focus in on babies, like everything I can find about babies. That's where we're headed next week. Because we've really spent the last 2 weeks, like the only baby we've seen is Moshe, and today we're gonna see zero babies. So that is where this course is headed. Yeah, so we did housekeeping. Good. So tonight's I got it tonight. I think what starts to come out last week, we had some really clear categories where like the heart of crying for adults is mourning, and everything else kind of feels like it could in some way be connected to that. We saw like family reunion as maybe the most sort of complicated instance of it. But even then we sort of said, wow, like family separation or family like hitparkut, like falling apart is a disaster when like your family is the whole people and there's two of you and your names are Yaakov and Esau or whatever, right? And there's a way in which like, yeah, like it dies with us, you know? So I wonder whether it could be connected. Um, and right, so we saw some outliers to like all crying is about death idea in the Tanakh that made it complicated, but it did sort of seem like some people were really into that idea. I think what we're gonna see in the Talmud is that it's like way more complicated, and even the crying about death is more complicated, which is actually fun, right? Because it's always fun when we have like a framing that exists or like a concept that exists in the Torah, and then the Talmud like blows it open, right? And that always happens, right? Like that's almost like what the Talmud is there for. So it's fun that we're gonna see it again with this sort of like abstract or like understudied idea about tears. So it's just I don't know. I was when I was working on this, I was like, oh, it's like so fun that this really sort of like random topic that follows the same pattern as everything else. I don't know, that was like that was exciting to me. And so yeah, so I think we have a lot of really interesting material. I'll just say the other thing by way of introduction is that sort of each of these stories we're going to look at tonight, even the shortest ones, we could spend an hour on. So we're going to be moving sort of like faster than I wish we could in order to get this like bigger scope picture. And even then, this is not a complete list of every time someone cries in the Talmud. I actually think the Talmud is like a really emotional and teary text in a way that's wonderful. We see a lot of rabbis crying. I think that's amazing. I think the vision of masculinity that is rabbis crying is kind of awesome. So we're gonna start out with a rabbi's wife crying, but we're gonna see a lot of rabbis cry tonight, and that means that we're gonna like be moving a little bit in a clip, but take the source sheet with you and definitely feel free to spend a lot more time on any of these stories. All right, here we go. Ooh, that's cool. Okay. So we'll just start off with the source that is where this class got its title from, which is Bava Metzia 59a. It also actually appears in the Gemara in Brachot. Um, but I felt like that was crazy to bring you both. So I did not do that. Okay, here we go. So, Rav Chinana, so where we're in the middle of is the Gemara's discussion about ona'ah, about oppression. And where this is going, this is the lead-in to the Tanur Shel Achnai story. So this is what comes before the Achnai story. And it's actually, once you read the Achnai story with this in the background, which a lot of people don't teach, it really changes things, I think. That the Achnai story is actually a meditation about oppression, and ona'ah is like a wild reframe, and it's not even a reframe because it's the actual frame in the actual literal Gemara. But in any event, when you learn Bamitzia in order, then you get to do exciting things like this. Okay, so Amar V'chinina B'rei de Rav Idi, so Rav Chinina son of Rav Idi says, "My dechtiv v'lo tonu ishet amito." What is the meaning of that which it says in Vayikra? You shall not mistreat each man his amit, his colleague. Sheidcha b'Torah v'mitzvot al tonehu. So, one who is with you in the observance of Torah and mitzvot, you should not mistreat him. And then, right, so amito, your amit in Torah. Am she'itcha, amito. Okay, and then Rav says, "Le'olam yehei adam zahir ba'ona'at ishto." A person should always be careful about mistreatment of his wife. Shemitoch shedimata mitzuya ona'ata krova. Since her tear, dimata mitzuya, her tear is easily elicited, punishment for her mistreatment is immediate. But I think that's that's one interpretation that they have here. The other way to say it is just that it's really easy to cause ona'ah to your wife. It's really easy to mistreat her. You live in close proximity with her. It's easy to cause her suffering, and she cries easily. And that, but it doesn't mean, like, I think it's not like women are crybabies. I think it's that marriage is ripe for oppression, which is, I think, obvious sort of in the world. People's numbers about like domestic violence is something like 50%. Like, it's really just like marriage is ripe for abuse. The rabbis knew it. And it's not like, oh, she cries so easily. It's that you can make her cry really easily because marriage is so easily an abusive dynamic. And then it becomes a situation of ona'ah, which is an Isur Torah, that you're not allowed to oppress the people around you, your partners in Torah and mitzvot, and who's more your partner in Torah and mitzvot than your spouse. And then Amar Rabbi Elazar, miyom shenecharav beit hamidrash nin'alu sha'arei tefillah. So the reason, right, Rav is couple generations after Rabbi Elazar. And he's quoting Rabbi Elazar, who says, from the day that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, the gates of Tefillah were closed. And then he quotes from Eicha Gam ki ezak ve'ashaveh satam tefillati. Though I plead and call out, he shuts out my prayer. The af al pi sha'arei tefillah nin'alu, despite the fact that the gates of prayer are locked, sha'arei dima'o lo nin'alu. The gates of tears are not locked. Then he quotes from Tehillim, Shim'at tefilati Hashem v'shavati azina el dimati al tacharesh. Hear my prayer, Lord. Give ear to my pleading. Keep not silence at my tears. So the gates of tears are not locked. So what that means is if you cause someone else to cry, that's a really serious thing. You have performed ona'ah, and who heard it? Kadosh Baruch Hu heard it. So it's not just you did like Ben Adam Lechaviro Isur. There might be monetary damages to be collected for ona'ah, for oppression. It's more than that. It's that when you oppress someone and you make them cry, and in this case they're saying specifically your wife, HaKadosh Baruch Hu hears that, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu hears tears. The gates of tears are not locked. So when you have that orientation, just to like step back for a second about that, when you have that orientation about tears, it means that causing someone to cry is a really big deal, and that crying yourself is very, very powerful form of tefillah. I'll just say that like for me this year, like my Kehila and I like sobbed together on Yom Kippur, and it was extremely meaningful. And it felt very different. It felt like a very different tefillah than usual. And it was a year that required a different tefillah than usual. And we sort of got to Ne'ilah, and it was like the gates we've been praying at. I don't know. I didn't really articulate this at the time, but I had this feeling of like the gates that we've been praying at today are gates that don't close. Like this type of prayer, like the gates can't be closed on it. And this line was very much sort of in my head of in my head about it. Um, so yeah, so I think this idea that there's like prayer and then there's crying, and that crying is like the next level of prayer. It's the like extreme level of prayer, and it's the type of thing that cannot be ignored. No matter what, the temple is destroyed, it doesn't matter. Like there's a way in which crying almost like supersedes or rebuilds or something like that. We saw texts last time, right? Hannah, when she's crying, some of her crying happens at home, but some of her crying happens at in Shiloh. It's not the temple, I guess, but either, but right, like some of it is this was a place, right? The Beit HaMikdash was a place of crying, and so I think the connection between the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the closing the gates of prayer, but keeping the gates of tears open, is then also almost like an act of rebuilding to potentially, or like coming closer to the power of the Beit HaMikdash. Prayer doesn't do it anymore, but tears can. And I think that framing about tears is really intense. I don't think that I'm not here to make a claim that the Talmud has some sort of coherency when it comes to tears. I think that would be a big claim, one that I'm not totally ready to say, but so there, but I think the fact that we see this idea, this Tanaitic idea about tears, or Rabbi Eliezer's a Tana, it gets quoted in Brachot and in Bava Metzia, like in multiple contexts. That's kind of interesting, like that this becomes this powerful notion about tears. Okay. I could talk about just this text for an hour, but I'm gonna force myself to move on from it. But I put it first, so hopefully it'll kind of like sit in the background. And then we have this other text. Again, this text you could talk about forever. Calderon spoke about this text, and she also wrote, and she has a chapter on it in her Bride for One Night book. Among other people, everyone loves this text. Everyone loves this story. So this is the story of Rav Rechume, and he was always studying with Rava in Mechuza. And before Yom Kippur, have a ragil da have ate lebeite kol male Yom Kippur. He would go home once a year on Erev Yom Kippur. And by the way, like it, in the context of Ketubot, it's clear that that's a problem, right? Because men have obligations to their wives that cannot be fulfilled one day here, cannot be fulfilled even on Yom Kippur, right? You have an obligation of Ona to your wife, and Yom Kippur is not a time for fulfilling the mitzvah of Ona. So there's like a whole problem happening with Rav Rechume from the beginning. Yom Echad Mashachte Shmata. One day he was particularly engrossed in his learning. Hava Misachya Devetu, and okay, one day he was particularly engrossed in his learning, and his wife was expecting him, and she would say, Hashda ate, he's coming now, he's coming now. Lo ata, and he didn't come because he was so engrossed in his learning. And she's sitting at home saying, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming now, he's coming now. Chalash data. She was super distressed. Achid dimata meina, and a tear falls from her eye, right? And this is you oppress your wife, tears fall from her eyes. And again, we jumped from Bava Metzia to Ketubot. These are not like obviously interconnected stories, but they also are. Like, to me, I don't know, I like can't hear one without the other. But they're not like juxtaposed by the Gemara itself. So she's very upset. a tear comes from her eye. Havayatev be'igara, and Rav Rehume is sitting on the roof. Achrit igra mitute v'nachnafshe, and the roof collapses under him and he dies. So a tear comes out of her eyes. She feels oppressed by her husband. The roof collapses under him. Okay, so this is again when we're talking about how powerful is crying. I think this is just like, not that what we read above couldn't be categorized as Agadah. If the Talmud is divided into Agadah and Halacha, then Sha'arei Tefillah, Sha'arei Dima'ot Lo Ninalu is probably Agadah in that construct. But this feels to me like the story version of Rob's statement, Lo Lam Yahat Adam Zahir Bona Ishto Shemitochti Matamatsuya Onat Hakrova. You have to be really, really careful not to press your wife because she will cry. And when she cries, it's Ona. And what happens when we bring Rabbi Elazar here? She's going to cry out of Ona. Hashem's going to hear her tears. There's going to be consequences. Then we see, right, Rav is a first generation Amora. He's the one who's speaking here. And we jump forward 4 generations to the Beit Midrash of Rava, and we see it exactly play out as described. She cries and her husband dies because he tortured her. So that's the closing the loop on the power of tears. Okay, so last week I said this in the introduction, right? We were really sitting in mourning, like the core thing that people cry over is death. So let's look at how that gets complicated in some of the Gemara's stories. So this is part of a longer, here we're back in Bava Metzia 84a. This is part of the longer cycle of the Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish stories, which are very famous and very beloved. But Reish Lakish, we're jumping in at the part where Reish Lakish dies. And Rabbi Vahave Kamitzar Rabbi Yochanan Batre Tuva, Rabbi Yochanan is very sad about it. Rabbanan Man Liza Yatove Lidate, who's gonna go and comfort the mind, Liatove, like Yishuv Hadat, like help Rabbi Yochanan find Yishuv Hadat, help him find comfort, help settle his mind. So they said Rabbi Elazar ben Padat, let Rabbi Elazar ben Padat go, because his learning is very sharp. Azal Yatev Kamei, he goes and he sits before Rabbi Yochanan. And every time Rabbi Yochanan would say something to him, Amar Lai, he would respond, Tani de Messiah, yes, there's a breita, there's a ruling that supports you. Amar at Kivar Lakisha, and Rabbi Yochanan would say back to him, are you like the son of Lakish? Are you like Reish Lakish? Bar Lakisha, Reish Lakish, ki have amina milta. Whenever I would say something, whenever I would believe something, Ava Makshili Esrin Va'arba Kushata. He would raise 24 difficulties against me. Umifar Kinan Le Esrin Va'arba Pirukai, and he would disprove my claim and he would raise 24 things, and then I would answer him 24 answers. Umimela Rav Chashmata, and through his 24 questions and my 24 answers, the halacha itself would become broadened and clarified, which is like so amazing, right? You can just imagine that. Like, I just love that image. Like, I would say something, he would ask me a shmillion questions, I would say a shmillion answers, and in between this thing happening here, you can imagine the halacha just growing and growing and growing, right? It's a cool image of like, what's the point of people yelling at each other? The point is that the halacha by nature just grows and develops within their kind of Socratic method of just asking, answering, asking, answering, and the truth just becomes exposed. It's like a very, I don't know, I just love that image. Okay. Okay, the Atamar, anyways, we're in the middle of Rabbi Yochanan yelling at Elazar ben Padat. And you say, Tani the Messiah, you say, oh, this teaching helps you. Atuli Adana Deshvir Kamina. Did you think I didn't know that what I originally said was good? Like, Rabbi Yochanan, of course, what I originally said was good. So then Rabbi Yochanan's very sad. He like runs away. Havaka Azil, Vakara, Maane. So he goes away and he tears his clothes, right? So that's like a mourning thing. He rends his clothes, and here we got to the crying part finally. Vakabechi, and he's crying. Va'amar, Heicha at Bar Lakisha, Heicha at Bar Lakisha. Where are you, son of Lakish? Where are you, son of Lakish? V'havakatzavach ad deshaf da'ate minei. He would scream until his mind, like shaf, was like I don't know how to, whatever. We'll just go with their translation. But until his mind like was taken from him, it like floated away from him. And then he lost his mind because out of his crying, and the rabbis daven that he should have that there should be mercy for him, i.e., they daven for him to die, which is also crazy, right? Like we never think it's a thing that people sort of do and feel bad about, like, oh, it would be better, like this person is suffering, it would be better if they weren't. But just so you know, it happens in the Gemara in a bunch of places, that the rabbis daven for rachamim, they daven for mercy for a person, but what that means is that person should die, and then he did die. So Rabbi Yochanan mourns Reish Lakish so much that he dies. There's something very problematic in there, actually. There's something really confusing and complex. Like, mourning in the Torah is the thing that you do and you cry. And then if you're Abraham, right, like you get up on your way and you marry another wife and you like move on with your life, right? And it just as one example. And that crying is meant to help you move past it. And here we see for Rabbi Yochanan that actually his crying gets so extreme that he loses his mind, and the other rabbis have pity on him and daven for mercy, and the manifestation of that mercy is that he dies. That's very hard. It's a very hard kind of idea or image of where this crying and mourning takes you. Is that crying here seems to be the maladaptive approach to mourning, and that really what everyone, because like Rabbi Yochanan's done at the end of it. Like you wish that Rabbi Yochanan could have found a way to exist in this world without Rish Lakish, and he could have found a way to not just cry and cry and cry and mourn and mourn and mourn. So it's actually adding complexity. I don't think this means, wow, you shouldn't tear your clothes and cry in mourning. I think it's saying doing that in the extreme causes more loss. And so it adds, that's what I was saying before, that when you have, like, we have a concept in the Torah and then it gets kind of like blown open by the Gemara. I think that's something that we're seeing here. Like you see it a little bit, right? We saw that in Eicha, that like, yeah, the city of Jerusalem, there's no one to comfort her because it's a thing that happened, right? As opposed to Rachel, where it's like you can be comforted from mourning for your people because, right? Right, Shavu me'aretz oyev, right? Your children are going to return. You don't have to cry. It's going to be okay. No one says that in Eicha to the city of Jerusalem. She's crying and crying, and ein menachim la. There's no one who comes to comfort her. But there's kind of like no critique inherent there. Like it's like, yeah, that's appropriate. And I think that here, I don't know, you could disagree with my read here, but I think there's almost a sense the rabbi said, like, we sent you Rabbi Elazar ben Padat, like, we try, like, you could have found someone else to learn with, like, you could have lowered your standards or come to appreciate somebody different, like, there could have been a more adaptive way to mourn Reish Lakish, and you did it, and that's maybe even a problem. And that he doesn't cry until now, which is also interesting. Like the crying is what takes him out of his mind. Okay, and then here's a case where someone doesn't cry. So Rabbi Chanina's daughter dies. Rabbi Chanina Shrivale Barte, or in Shabbat 151b. Lo hava kabachi alei, and he doesn't cry for her. Amra le devetu, and his wife says to him, Tarna golda apekta mi beitach. Have you let a chicken out of your house? Like, why are you not crying? Your daughter is not a chicken. Like, she matters. You should be crying that she died. Amarle, and he says, Amarle, he says to her, Tarte tachala ve'ivra. If I cry, I will suffer twice from bereavement and from blindness. I think that we're about to literally quote Rabbi Yochanan, which I think is really interesting. This is, by the way, the context in Shabbat here. I should have mentioned that going in. It's like a wild context. It's like things that are bad for your eyes. It's the like optometry section or like ophthalmology section of the Gemara. So that's what's happening here. I obviously like cherry picked it out of its context. But it's like, yeah, you're not mourning and you're not crying because if I cry, I'll go blind. Savar la ki adam Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Yossi ben Katzarta. I don't know anything else about Rabbi Yossi ben Katzarta, in case you were wondering. The Gemara, he held in accordance with the statement that Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Katzarta, Sheish Dimaot Hen, there are 6 types of tears. In case you were wondering, there are 6 types of tears, which is actually interesting because I tried to do like this taxonomy last time, and we didn't hit all the types of tears described here. So 6 different times, Shalosh Yafot v'Shalosh Ra'ot, 3 are good, 3 are bad. Al Ashan v'Shal Bachi v'Shal Beit HaKisei Ra'ot. So tears that come from smoke, tears from crying, and tears from pain in the bathroom. In case anyone thought that inflammatory bowel disease was like new to the Jewish people, we're going to see more of it even tonight. Inflammatory bowel disease is like all over the Gemara. And this is one of those cases. It's just a category of pain all unto itself, the pain of the bathroom. Yeah, okay, so those ones are ra'ot. So crying from smoke, sorrow, and pain in the bathroom, those are ra'ot, those are bad for your eyes. And the 3 types of tears are good for your eyes, shel sam, v'shel schok, v'shel pirot. This is another time where we have bechi and schok, by the way, are two opposites from Kohelet, which you're shortly supposed to be thinking of when we see this. So tears that are good for the eyes are from medicinal drugs, which I think is also kind of cute because like we still think that's true. Like you put eye drops in and they make your eyes tear, like that's good. Tears from medicinal drugs, tears from laughter are good for the eyes. By the way, we haven't seen tears from laughter until right now. So that's also like nice to see. And then tears from sharp produce are good for the eyes, which whenever I make soup, I don't feel that way, but okay. I'm glad that the Gemara thinks that my onion-themed tears are good for my eyes. So that's kind of nice. And so it's sort of like a wild story because this piece, like good for your eyes, bad for your eyes, that's the context in the Gemara and Shabbos. That's like what's happening. But the story that is part of it is crazy. Like, I mean, not crazy, but it's like very sad, right? Rabbi Chanina's daughter dies, and his wife says to him, like, your daughter is not a chicken. Like, cry over her. Like, be sad. And he's like, it's bad for my health to be sad and to cry in that way. And then we literally just saw Rabbi Yochanan cry until he goes insane, and he cites Rabbi Yochanan as a source for that. So I just think there's something here about mourning and a concern about crying in mourning that it's actually bad for you, that crying in mourning is dangerous. And I think that's like a real humongous shift from what we saw in the Torah, where like that's like the number 1 form of crying. And you're kind of like supposed to do that. Like someone you love dies, let's say, you're supposed to cry for them. And here it's like crying is bad for your health. And maybe then almost like a pushback on like crying here doesn't just represent normal mourning, it represents extreme mourning. And you sort of wonder about the cultural shift that is represented with that. It's just yeah. Like it seems like everything about tears, like in these 4 sources we've looked at so far, like the dial got turned way up from what the Torah was saying. Like, yep, like she's gonna cry and her husband will die. Like that's the Rav Rehume story. And you're gonna cry and you're gonna go insane. Or you're gonna hold yourself back from crying for fear that if you do cry, your eyes will get damaged, or potentially I'm trying to read it in conversation with the other Rabbi Yochanan story where you will you might go insane if you start crying, which by the way, like from a psychologist today, I have a lot to say about that because I think it's actually like a real feeling. Like if I start crying about this, I will never stop, so let me just like shove it down inside. Like we don't think that that's like the right way to deal with grief, which I know that many of the people on this call know, but I just thought it's, you know, sort of worth saying. Because I think that feeling of like if I start crying I'll never stop is clearly very real. Okay, just gonna breathe on that for a second. All right, so this is a very interesting, complicated text, this one, Brachot 5b. And it's, again, it has critiques of certain types of crying in it, but then there's a good type of crying, and it's not like the good type of crying over laughter. It's like the right type of thing to be sad and cry over, which is fascinating, wild, crazy. Okay, so Rabbi Elazar Chalash al legabe Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Elazar gets sick. Rabbi Yochanan comes to visit him. Chaze dahave kagane bevi afel, and he sees that he is lying in a dark room. Gale lidare v'nafal nehura. Okay, so this is like wild, right? For Rabbi Yochanan, he's like very, very beautiful. So he exposes his arm and light radiates from his flesh. And then, right, so he's like, all right, like, gotta light up this room, like the same way we would do now with our, I don't know, like in Harry Potter, it'd be like Lumos, or like, you know, you would like turn on your flashlight for your phone, like whatever. This story is crazy. Anyways, okay. So he just exposes his arm and the room lights up, and he sees that Rabbi Elazar is crying. Chazeh daha kabechi Rabbi Elazar. Amarle, and he says to him, Amai kabechi, why are you crying? Mishum Torah de lo afasht. Shaninu echad amarba v'echad amamit v'vachi kavin libo l'shem shemayim. If you're weeping because you didn't study as much Torah as you have wanted, we've learned, right? One who brings a lot and one who brings a little, they all have merit as long as your heart is directed towards heaven. Like it's okay. Echad amarba echad amamit. Like you studied a lot, you studied a little, you had good intentions, right? You're mekavin libo l'shem shemayim. That's sufficient. The mishum mezone, and if it was if you're weakening because you're not making enough money, lo kol adam zochel shtei shulchanot. It's okay, like and not everyone merits to eat off of 2 tables. And what they mean by that is you ate off the table of Torah and you didn't eat off the table of wealth. Not everyone gets to do both of those, and you ate off the table of Torah. That's the way, at least like the Parshan Dune explains it, and that's what they have in the English here. V'i mishum b'nei, and if you're crying over children who have died, Din Garma de Asira Abir. Okay, this is really sad. He says, this is the bone of my 10th son, which is like my 10th son died, and I'm still holding on to a bone of his, which is like really hard and sad and scary and also like wild because like we're supposed to bury. And actually I'll just like as a quick aside, Glickle of Havel lost two children, and she makes sense of her loss through this story, through the idea that like you would hold on to your departed child's bone, and it becomes this image for her that feels very important in the processing of her own loss, which is just sort of interesting. It wouldn't be like the image that I would choose necessarily, and to me it's always like, oh, like you never know what's gonna like speak to someone in the Talmud, and obviously never been quite in exactly her situation, so in any event. Okay. So he says, like I've been there, and he understands it to be this goes we're in the context of a discussion about afflictions of love, and so he understands that suffering over the loss of children, it afflicted me as well. He's saying, and I'm with you, and it's sort of like common. And then he says, Amrle, Lahai Shufra, Divali Ba'afra Kabachina. And Rabbi Elazar says to Rabbi Yochanan, no, I'm not crying over any of that. Rather, I'm crying over this beauty of yours that will decompose in the earth. That's why I'm crying. And then Rabbi Yochanan says back to him, Amrle, al da vadai kabachi ubachu travai. And Rabbi Yochanan says, oh, well, that is certainly appropriate to cry over. And then they both cried. So what is it? Lahai shufra devale ba'afra kabachina. This beauty of yours that will decompose in the earth, i.e., mortality more broadly. That's how people interpret it, less about like the specific beauty of Rabbi Yochanan. Like that's kind of strange thing to say, oh, like your children died, no big deal, but your beauty, well, that's a big deal. But like obviously that's not the order of things. So the way it gets interpreted, and the way it's interpreted in this translation, is that it's about human mortality in general, like the idea that like everything good about this life is fleeting and that's gonna go away. And Rabbi Yochanan says, oh yeah, well that thing to cry about I can get behind. And then they cry together. And then after they've cried together, by the way, right? So after a while, Rabbi Yochanan says to him, "Chavivina lacha yisurin, is your suffering dear to you?" Rabbi Eliezer says, "Lo hin velo scharan, no, not this suffering and not its reward." And then Rabbi Yochanan, with his, again, like his magic illuminated arm thing, says, Amar le'ahav liyadach. He says, give me your hand. Yav le'yadai. Rabbi Elazar gave him his hand. Ukvei. And he stands up, and he's restored to health. So they have this good cry together about the fleeting nature of human beauty, the fleeting nature of mortality, life in general. And then they say, okay, this suffering is not good for anyone, and let's hold on to my magic hand, and we'll get up together, which is like, again, each of these stories is like more wild than the last. Welcome to the Talmud. It's great. But this idea that like we saw this sort of criticism almost of, or particularly by Rabbi Hanina, of overly mourning his own daughter. And then here we're seeing, again, a criticism of all this other stuff. It's hard to say criticism or an attempt to comfort. Like, oh, you're crying because you think you didn't learn enough Torah? Don't cry over that. Oh, you're crying because you don't have enough food to eat, or like you're not wealthy? Like, don't cry over that. Oh, you're crying because you lost children? Don't cry over that. Oh, you're crying because everything in this world that's beautiful dies. Like, okay, that I can kind of get behind, which I think is just like so so fascinating and surprising. Right. So the question Liz poses is this Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat? To the best of my knowledge, there is debate about who this Rabbi Elazar is. But I think it's convincing that it would be Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat. But the thing that makes me not want to see that is that, like, I don't know, Glickle thinks it's not Rabbi Yochanan, and I hate like disagreeing with her. She thinks it's like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. That's who she quotes it as, which to me is like hard because it really doesn't seem to me to be Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It doesn't really like fully make sense for it to be Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. But that's why I'm sort of like, oh, if I'm gonna, and also like, why would I trust her as an interpreter? Anyways, whatever. So that's the only reason why I'm like holding back. I think it is likely Rabbi Elazar ben Padat, and then it also like puts us back into those same conversations of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar ben Padat, where Rabbi Elazar ben Padat failed to provide the necessary comfort to Rabbi Yochanan, and then Rabbi Yochanan dies. And so here we're seeing the other direction where somehow Rabbi Yochanan cries with him. And to me, I think that's the piece. Like that there's a lot going on here, right? They're like, don't cry over this, don't cry over that, don't cry over the other. But that what actually ends up helping is two things. One, they cry together, which is beautiful. And I think if there was ever a takeaway about crying, it is surely that crying together is a thing that helps. And two, that then he says, do you want to keep feeling like this? Which is also really interesting that he has to articulate that. And then the articulation is like, no, I understand there's benefits to feeling like this, but I don't want those benefits. And I don't want to feel like this anymore. And then he says, okay, take my hand. Let's get up. I think there's a lot of deep Torah in that 3-step process. We're going to cry together. We're going to discuss how we feel and whether we want to keep feeling like it. And once the answer is, I don't want to keep feeling like this, come take my hand. Let me help you out of the hole. I think it's a very powerful 3-step process and image, and a real model, by the way, for how to provide support to other people. And I would eliminate the like, why are you crying about this? But that part of this conversation, I don't know that I would recommend emulating all the time. But the end of this, I think, is really, really awesome. And then also the Gemara sort of sense that like, oh, the right, I'm interested in the Gemara sense that like, oh, the right thing to cry about is this like big picture existential thinking. I think that's just like interesting. Okay, so this is another crying about mortality moment. There's a lot happening here. We were just in, we've been in the 80s in Bava Mitzvah here before. Anyway, so this is Rabbi Yudah Nasi suffers. We talked already about how painful it is in the bathroom for some of these people. Rabbi Yudah Nasi has bathroom themed pain, and he screams so loudly that all of the animals eating and making lots of noise are still not as loud as he is, and people who are like traveling by sea can hear him screaming from the bathroom. That's how much pain he's in. And the Gemara says his pain came on for a reason. Where did his pain come from? So so what is that incident? So this is actually, we're going to see an animal cry in a second. And so there is a calf that was being led to the slaughter. Azal Talia Larishe Bekanfe de Rebbe Vekabachi. And it goes and it hangs its head in the corner of Rabbi Yudah Nasi's robes, and it's weeping. And Rabbi Yudah Nasi says, Zil, get out of here. Like, you were made for the slaughter. I don't care about your cow tears. And then he's like judged on high. Amre, and this person needs to suffer because he didn't show mercy to this creature. So the creature is crying, right? The exile, the calf is crying because it's gonna die. It's mourning for itself. It's thinking about its own mortality. Hard to say. Like, I mean, there's a lot of modern Talmud scholarship about like animal consciousness in the Talmud. I'm not fully holding in all of it, but I'm sure people have opinions about this calf. But in any event, right? Like I think imposing the model that we saw in the Gemara and Brachot in source 5 onto here is interesting, right? He didn't cry with the calf. He didn't ask the calf what it wanted. He didn't give the calf a hand. And in retribution for that, the heavenly court, or whoever the decision maker in the story, gives him suffering. He gets punished actually for it. Or we honestly gets punished for not crying with the calf, I think. Which is, or not showing it compassion, at least. Which I think is just like really surprising and interesting, considering that it's a calf. If you wanted a good text to be to base your vegetarianism on, this would be a good one. Yeah. Okay. So now we're in, this next story comes to you from the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai story cycle. And this is kind of towards the end. So they have come out of the cave, and Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair comes to greet them when they've come out of the cave, and he brings them into the bathhouse. And Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair brings them into the bathhouse. And remember, they've been like up to their necks in sand most of the time, and that did real damage to their skin, which is very conceivable. So he brings them, and he's tending to their flesh. And he sees that there's cracks. And Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair is very upset by what he's seeing. And he's crying. And then what happens? And the tears fell off of his eyes. And he caused Rabbi Shimon to scream, because the salt of his tears fall into the cracks in Rabbi Shimon's skin. And Rabbi Shimon screams. So I think this is the other side of empathy, right? We just saw the existential angst, empathy helps you out. Oh, we're crying together. But here they're not crying together. Here Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair is crying, and his tears are injuring Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he's not crying, he's screaming. And this describes that moment that's like almost like fake empathy, like, oh wow, I'm so hurt by what's happened to you, that like the injured party ends up almost like comforting. And that's literally what's about to happen. The injured party here ends up comforting the guy who's trying to wash him in the bathhouse. So here's what happens. Amar lo oily Pinchas ben Yair says, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm seeing you like this. And he says, no, ashracha shereitani bekach. No, happy are you that you've seen me like this. Shil malei lo reitani bekach. Because if you hadn't seen me like this, lo matzata bikach. You would not have found me as I am, i.e. a gadol b'Torah, because I just spent all of these years doing nothing other than learning. And yes, I came away from that with, like, my skin is all degraded, but like, wow, my Torah is awesome. And I think you really see, like, wow, this image of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair crying and then actually causing double harm to Rabbi Shimon, to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai through his tears, that my tears are injuring the injured party. And that's a perversion of empathy, right? So the good empathy, the good tears of empathy is we're crying together, or at least I'm attending to the injured party's tears, which is what Rabbi Danasi did not do in the previous source, in source 6. And here we have the non-injured party doing the crying and empathy, and actually then ends up having to be comforted by the injured party, which is clearly a perversion. Okay. I want to talk about children. Oh gosh, we only have 10 minutes. Okay, we're just going to do these two sources really quickly. We can't not talk about children. I'll just say these are described as children. This is even described as a yanuka, like one who is still nursing, but it's clearly not. And the word yanuka in the Talmud does not correlate to nursing, but that's like literally what the word means, but it's just a word that describes like a smaller child. But it can't be so small of a child in the story because you're going to see how the story unfolds. And so this is not like a toddler talking. So Ahuya Nuka de Tavu Ladina. So there's a child who was taken to court, Kamedur of Nachman. Before Nachman, we're in Sanhedrin 31a. Amar le itlach Saadeh, and they said, do you have witnesses? He says, no. Itlach Raya, do you have evidence? The child says, no. Amar le, Amar le lo, right? Ilach Raya, Amar le lo. Chayve Rav Nachman, so Rav Nachman deemed him liable, presumably to like pay up to whoever had taken him to court, whatever it is. So then this child is crying, Va'azil, and he's going on his way, and he's crying, and he's upset. Shamu Hanach Inche, and all these people heard him. Amrulay, and they said to him, Ananya Dinan B'mile De'avuch, and they said, oh, we know about the monetary matters of your father, we can help you out. And then Amar Rabbi Nachman Baha Afil Rabbana Mode Deanuka B'mili Davud Lo Yada, and Rabbi Yochanan, he's willing to go back and sort of reconsider the case and blah, blah, whatever. There's this whole like legal discussion about whether children are expected to know anything about their parents' monetary matters. And there's actually another we're about to see, another crying source about children and their parents' monetary matters in 1 second, children crying about it. But the whole point here is like this child is crying just because like an injustice was wrought against him, right? It's not any of that like big existential, like, wow, all people die. No, it's just like he went to court, a really embarrassing thing happened, something happened out of his control. Something happened that he couldn't like manage, and he's overwhelmed, and he gets ruled against. Like imagine this like child getting dragged to court, seemingly clearly like if a child is getting dragged to court, he doesn't have parents around. It seems here clear that the parents have died, and this super overwhelming thing happened, and like no one showed up for him, and then he's walking around crying, and like there seems to be a lot of right that ends up coming from that crying, because he's crying, people hear it, and then they come to his assistance. And so the crying as a child call for help that gets answered is a good thing here. And again, like it's not exactly an infant that cries, but I do think that like the pain of children, including emotional pain or like injustice themed pain, also like it gets taken seriously in this story. It's not just like, okay, the world isn't fair, little boy, like sorry that you're crying, off with you, which I think is an orientation that the world often has towards the crying of children and in situations of injustice. Here it gets taken seriously, and he sees resolution. So another kind of similar story from Cholin. So Avua de Shmuel Ashkeche LeShmuel de Kabechi. So Shmuel's father finds little Shmuel crying, and he says, Amarle Amai Kabachit. He says to him, oh, little Shmuel, like, why are you crying? And Shmuel says, Demachyan Rabbi, my teacher hit me. And he says, Amai, like, why did he strike you? And Shmuel says, the Amarli Kasafi Librai, the Lo Mashid Yadai. So Shmuel says, my teacher said to me, you're feeding my son, but you didn't wash your hands. The Amai Lo Mashid, and why didn't you wash your hands? Shmuel said, Have achal va'ana mashina. Shmuel says, only the teacher's son is eating. I have to wash my hands when someone else is eating. Amarle lo mistayed lo gamir mimchanami machi. So Shmuel's dad, on Shmuel's behalf, gets all angry, and he says it's not enough that your teacher didn't learn the halacha properly. He even hits you for making the mistake. And here, so the Gemara goes on to say, yeah, and the halacha is that if you eat by means of another feeding you, then you, the eater, needs to wash your hands, even though you don't touch the food, but the one who does the feeding doesn't have to wash, which is like really interesting. Like you might have really thought that the other way, and the halacha is a little bit more complicated than the Gemara lets on. But to me, what I'm interested in is the story of Shmuel crying to his father, not, oh, my teacher hit me, but my teacher seems to be my teacher rendered an injustice against me. And the father taking that seriously, and also then like going on his way to like educate the teacher better, and being angry on his child's behalf, which is what we saw also in the previous story of the child being crying in this injustice, and adults actually rallying behind the child's sense of injustice, which I think is really cool. And I know I'm like super close to out of time. We can't not see these texts. Gittin 9dB is a quite famous one. It's very complicated, the whole idea, but Gemara has this idea that when you divorce your first wife, the Mizbeach cries. So again, Judaism like has very complicated perspective on divorce, mostly towards like if your marriage is over, you should get divorced. But you divorce your first wife, the Mizbeach cries about it, says the Gemara. But the one I want to really focus on for a second is this Gemara and Chagiga, and then I'll stick around a little bit long and take questions. So it's Rabbanit, Shlusha, Kadosh Baruch Hu Bochel, and Kadosh Baruch Hu also cries. Hashem cries for three types of people every day. B'chol yom, afshar la'asok b'Torah ve'ino osik. Kadosh Baruch Hu cries for one who's able to study Torah but doesn't. Al she'i afshar la'asok b'Torah ve'osik. Kadosh Baruch Hu cries for the one who is unable to engage in Torah study and nevertheless does it. V'al parnas hamitga'el atzibor, and for a leader who lords over the community. This is a really interesting text, in part because of number 2, the one who's not able to study and does it. Because 1 and 3 are clearly things that are bad, right? One who is able to study Torah and doesn't study Torah, that's clearly upsetting. 3, the Parnasa Mikael Atzibor, seems like you have a leader of a community who's taking advantage of his position. Okay, I can understand why Kadosh Baruch would be crying about that. But the one who's unable to study and still does it doesn't seem like a bad thing. That seems like a good thing. So, and right, it seems like, wow, you're doing your hishtadlus. So I think that the way this is often interpreted is like this person doesn't have the ability to engage in Torah and therefore is like perverting it, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is crying. But a different way to read it is that tears are really complicated, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu cries also in joy or in relief or just in like this, maybe in love, in happiness, right? Like there's like this other side of crying, this like happy side of crying, that maybe is coming out here also. And where I want to go with this for just a second is that there's a type of crying that I have seen some amount of, and certainly experienced some amount of, which is simply like an authenticity type of crying when like you finally get the truth out of your mouth, crying when you're just saying something that's like so real and so important to you that you've had trouble articulating. To me, like writing can be a very emotional process also. Like when I finally like just figure out like what the true thing is that I'm trying to get out there and get it down, like that can be like a teary kind of release experience to me. And also seeing things or reading things that just feel like deeply true, deeply authentic, like, or like deeply full of effort, like that can move me to tears also. And I was really looking for that in the Gemara, and I kind of thought maybe the source about like mortality, oh, I'm crying about the idea that like someone as beautiful as you is gonna die someday, like maybe that was like oh, I'm not crying about this, no, I'm searching for like the authentic thing I'm gonna cry about. Oh, what I'm crying about is mortality. Like that was like a candidate for that type of tears. But ultimately I sort of didn't, I didn't really want to use that text in that way, and it wasn't really speaking to me. And I got to this, and I was like, wow, Kadosh Baruch Hu cries about the person who can't learn and learns anyways. And that maybe felt to me like Kadosh Baruch Hu was moved by it. And that's sort of a type of crying that I felt like was really underexplored. in the Gemara's crying texts that I saw. And not to say that I've seen absolutely every time that someone cries in the Gemara. People cry a lot in the Gemara, and those texts are not so easy to find. Like the keywords aren't going to get you all of the times that people cry in the Gemara. I'm sure there's more in there than I was able to present today. And maybe there's something that like perfectly gets to that, like I'm crying because I'm moved, which is a category that I'm really interested in and was hoping to kind of find and excavate with you. And this is sort of the closest I could come to. Okay, so with that, I see there's something in the chat here. Let me look at that. I wonder if injustice is the theme that unites valid crying in the Gemara. Liz, do you want to say more about that? I like the idea that injustice is a like unifying theme. I think there's something strong there.
Yes, but Ayala's watching YouTube, TikTok in the background, so we'll see how this goes. It feels like the ones where crying ends well, or at any rate, the person who cries is validated, all seem to be cries about injustice. We have Leah Herkenes, the wife of Rav Ruchami, like even Rabbi Yochanan and sort of the tears of the nature of mortality and death, like those all feel like tears about sort of the unjust nature of the world, and those are things that
children also injustice, yeah.
That like the crier is validated in the end, as opposed to the stories and the calf, which seems to reasonably be upset about the injustice of having to be slaughtered for food, as opposed to the situations where the person crying doesn't get validated, that like it's too excessive, you are getting punished for it. Those don't seem to be about injustice in the same way. And I'm just wondering if the theme of if Tanakh is about mourning, then the Gemara is about injustice. And I'm just
and suppresses mourning when it's not about injustice, which is cool. That's a cool read. God, I love learning Torah with you. This is Rabbanit Liz Shane, for anyone who doesn't know her. She's on the faculty of Maharat. She's brilliant. She could also be giving this year just as easily. Yeah, right. Chaya's articulation is outrage, which I think is like same vibe. Yeah. I like that a lot. Yeah, that's an exciting idea. Cool. Okay, does anyone else have questions? Otherwise, we should wrap.
I have just a quick comment, but I'm just still thinking about God crying about people who can't learn Torah and do anyway. And this is probably too much of a projection. Like I have to think about it more to make it into like a category. But I know that like when I like cry in movies and things like that, the things that often get me are like moments of complexity, of like something bittersweet or like a love that comes with pain or something like that. And so that like it's really striking to me as like that being like a sort of messy situation that engenders tears, which is kind of trying to build on what you were saying about being moved. And I wonder if there's like a very specific kind of movingness to something that's mixed. But that's just something I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like there is that simple read that like, oh, the Torah is endangered by this person, but I like can't tolerate that read because I don't think the Torah is endangered by people who learn it. So, I want to like both say like this problem is easily resolved unless you share my commitments that like the Torah is for all the Jews and the Jews can't damage the Torah through their learning. But like I just have to like own that that's like a Leah Sarna hang up that's getting in the way of putting forward a best read.
That seems very reasonable to me. I don't know. Should we pause for just a minute? Are there any other questions?
Yeah, go ahead. And we'll be back next week, and next week we're doing all children.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, Sarna, and thank you to everyone again for joining us. Very quickly, because I do want to let everyone go, we do have so many excited classes going on at Drusha currently, and in 2 weeks we're going to have our winter week with Seder Ian every morning and really excited classes in the afternoons. So please check those out at drusha.org/classes, and looking forward to seeing you all next week.